Hello, everyone, and welcome to Toast and Topics. The weather has been balmy this October along the East Coast, but over the past few weeks, much of the southern U.S. has been racked by large hurricanes, including Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton. The latter storm attracted huge concern due to the rapidity with which it intensified and because, for a time, it appeared to be headed straight for the Tampa Bay metro area, the 18th most populous metro area in the country.
Yeah, both of these storms were really quite something. And before we start on this week's episode, we wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the damage and human toll that these disasters took on the country. Our thoughts and prayers go out to those families who were impacted.
I'm into that. But now, being the nerds that we are, and given everything that has been going on, we thought that this would be a good opportunity to talk about the risks posed by the increase of tropical storms in the United States, specifically the risk posed to development. So, in this episode, we're going to focus on the extent to which storms and natural disasters in the United States have gotten worse over the past several decades, why, in spite of their getting worse, so many people are still moving to hurricane-prone areas, and finally, the effect that these hurricanes may have on future development. So let's get into it. Sachin, do you want to start us off here?
Yeah, so as you said, Ben, Hurricane Milton made landfall in Florida on October 9th, and that was just 2 weeks after Hurricane Helene killed at least 200 people in America's southeast. Some 5.5 million residents were issued with evacuation orders, leading to large traffic jams out of the impacted areas. And all told, the storm is expected to cost some $100 billion. That would make Milton one of the most expensive hurricanes in American history. Now, there's a lot of scientific literature that's been published over the past 20 years, and they have shown fairly conclusively that storms are getting worse. And regardless of your views on climate change, it's fair to say that the climate has changed in more ways than one. For example, the world today is on average 1.3 degrees Celsius hotter than it was before the Industrial Revolution. And since then, there has not necessarily been an increase in the number of tropical cyclones and storms each season, but the storms themselves are becoming stronger, slower, wetter, and just more intense.
Wow. So, what is the connection between warmer temperatures and more severe storms?
The connection here has to do with warmer oceans. More than 90% of the extra heat within the climate system is sucked up by our oceans. Warmer air also holds more moisture, which helps hurricanes last longer once they reach the coast, and that increases the amount of water that they can dump as rain. There's a lot of data that shows that the average surface temperatures of our planet's oceans are around zero point 0.8 degrees Celsius above the 20th century average. And just to put this into perspective here, between 1980 and 2017, the oceans absorbed more than 3 times the amount of energy contained in the whole world's fossil fuel reserve. And that extra power allows storms to intensify more quickly. On top of this, storms are also more severe because of higher sea levels. Around Fort Myers in Florida, for example, sea levels are about 33.7 centimeters higher today than they were a century ago. So that means that storm surges travel farther inland and they reach more people and buildings. Hurricanes will also follow the path determined by airflow in various parts of the atmosphere, and those airflows seem to be growing more sluggish over time, though there's no real conclusive evidence as to why. And just another stat here, the average forward speed of North Atlantic hurricanes decreased by 17% from 1944 to 2017. And that means it's more likely today that hurricanes move more slowly or stay in one location for longer, both of which increase their capacity for destruction.
Huh. That's really interesting, Sachin. And on your point about destruction, I recently read that the total cost of weather and climate disasters in America in the past 5 years was $788 billion. And storms are the largest contributor to this bill. What's crazy is that the total cost in the past 5 years equates to about a third of the total cost of storms from 1980 to 2022, adjusting for inflation.
Wow, that's an interesting stat. And Really fascinating, Ben. Now, to be fair, this doesn't all have to do with the changing climate and storms just being more severe. What's interesting to me is that over this same period, the propensity for Americans to build property and infrastructure along coastlines and in high-risk areas seems to have also gone up. And I know that you've done some investigation into this, Ben, so I'm curious as to why this is the case.
Yeah, that's right. Despite storms getting worse and worse, scores of people are still moving to areas that face significant risk from storms, in particular hurricanes. Just some stats to sum that up here. During the 2010s, the US population grew by more than 7%, but in the West and the South, which are the areas that are most prone to storms and other natural disasters, the population grew by 9 and 10% respectively. So outpacing the growth rate of the population nationally. And reporting from the New York Times underscores this. Many locations in the north, and in particular expensive coastal cities like New York, have lost residents recently, while we have seen populations surge in areas such as Florida. As such, there are simply more developments in high risk areas. From 2019 through 2023, for example, Florida has built 77,000 new buildings in high risk flood areas, more than any other state. But Florida isn't alone. In that same period, Texas built 63,000 such properties, and California added another 21,000 such properties. Of course, that raises the question of why people are opting to move to these riskier areas. And there are several reasons for this. Cost is the primary one. Florida, for example, is the 12th most expensive state overall. And that might sound high, but in comparison to high population states such as New York or California or Massachusetts, all of which are in the top 10, it's comparatively a bargain. And ditto for Texas, which is the 21st most expensive state, and the Carolinas, which are the 26th and 27th most expensive states. In short, states with bad weather are also often the ones that residents can actually afford to live in at a reasonably high quality of life. Lifestyle was the next reason. States that are prone to climate disasters, for example, Florida, are also, quite frankly, known for beautiful beaches and sunny weather. It's hard not to understand why that holds appeal for people. According to Jeff Lickenstein of Ecofine Properties in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida, buyers want to live where they want to live. It's why the coasts are so filled with people no matter where in the world. We like warm weather and water, which I think sums it up pretty well. So, at the end of the day, storms actually aren't a very large deterrent to people moving to at risk areas. As Mahalia Clark, a graduate fellow at the University of Vermont, describes it, quote, there are 20 different factors in weighing where people want to move. Higher up on the list is where friends and family live, where I can afford to move. And much lower down is what the risk of a hurricane or wildfire is. Indeed, people tend to be, quote, low information home buyers. They often are not even aware of seemingly remote risks, such as climate disasters, when making home buying choices. And so, in short, it doesn't seem that people are going to be moving away from any of these at risk areas soon, which raises the question, how should we think about risk for people who are exposed to these kinds of disasters?
That was well summarized, Ben. Thank you for that. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about risk. So for companies and governments, the confluence of these factors have led more of them to evaluate and actually try to quantify the impact of climate risk as its own unique category under the risk management umbrella. In fact, First Street and Zillow, which are two real estate brokers, are currently teaming up to create a first of its kind rating system to assess climate risks on properties that are for sale, with key risks including the impact of heat, wind, and most importantly, flooding on properties. And for home buyers, it's becoming increasingly important not only to understand what the risk is today, but what the risk may look like into the future and how that might impact their own pocketbook and finances. And it's not just households. Governments, corporations, everyone really are thinking about how to quantify and communicate climate risk in a better way. Um, and it warrants a few minutes talking about how this works and thinking about it through the lens of an economist as well. So companies will quantify climate risk by integrating various analytical methods and metrics to evaluate the potential impacts on their operations and financial performance. And there's a couple ways to evaluate this. The first umbrella is called scenario analysis, and companies will use scenario analysis to model different climate-related futures, and that involves evaluating how varying levels of climate change, regulatory policies, and technological advances might affect the business. For example, a company might model how rising temperatures might impact energy costs or supply chains under different policy scenarios. There's also physical risks that companies have to start thinking about. That includes the effect of extreme weather, such as floods, droughts, and hurricanes, as well as longer-term shifts in weather patterns on their operations. For example, utilities or real estate companies may use geographic information systems to map the risk of coastal areas or infrastructure vulnerability to climate change. And finally, companies have to think about transition risks. That is defined as the risk associated with actually shifting towards a lower carbon economy. Companies will analyze the cost of things like regulatory changes, such as carbon taxes, technological disruptions, as well as shifts in consumer preferences. And quantifying this involves estimating the potential costs of complying with new climate policies or investigating cleaner technologies. For example, an oil company might want to quantify the financial impact of a carbon tax by estimating how much it would increase the operational cost of doing business based on their current emission levels. And what I think is really fascinating here is that both physical risk and transition risk need to be evaluated in the context of a company's entire supply chain, not just for the company itself. Companies not only need to understand and analyze their own exposure, but they have to think about how this would impact every single component of their supply chain and identify the key players that might be at risk of environmental disruptions.
I see. That's a great overview, Sachin. And given that, I think that there are some factors that are worth keeping in mind for people and companies moving to such disaster-prone areas. And so I'm going to list a couple of the ones that I think are important now. The first is insurance premiums. That is the cost to an individual to be insured against such disasters. And already, just because of the increasing prevalence of high intensity storms, insurance premiums on properties in at-risk areas have skyrocketed. Average homeowner premiums in Florida, for example, are up nearly 60% since 2019. And that's going to make it more difficult in the long term for people to continue to live affordably in these areas, in spite of the appeal that they have had recently in comparison to relatively expensive northern cities. It also may mean that the entire system of providing disaster insurance may need to be reformed. Despite rising premiums, the cost of repairing damage from these natural disasters are really incredibly high, and these costs are burdening state level insurers, meaning that over time there may be a shift toward broader federal efforts to insure disaster prone areas, which is going to be controversial and interesting to see play out. Now, the second point that I think is just worth touching on is what's going to happen in the longer term. I think that the natural disasters that we've seen recently do raise important questions about the viability of our inhabiting places that are so at risk and so inimical to human habitation. Florida was not always regarded as a tropical paradise, for example. The first Americans who visited the place, I think it's worth noting, were absolutely appalled by its climate. Quote, Florida is certainly one of the poorest countries that ever two people have quarreled for, unquote, one army surgeon fighting the Seminole Indians wrote in the 1830s. And, quote, it was the most dreary and pandemonium-like region I ever visited. Nothing but barren wastes, unquote. I really think that that just underscores that Florida is not exactly a friendly place for people to live. And modern technology has allowed us to come a long way in making places like Florida ideal. But at the same time, as storms and heat waves intensify, I think it's worth bearing in mind what our initial impressions were of these places. They're not inherently friendly to human habitation, and I don't think that we should take it for granted that they will always continue to be.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ben. That may have been a little harsh on Florida, but I can understand the sentiment in that piece. Um, and I guess the fact that we're putting so much effort into this kind of risk forecasting may also indicate that the level of risk associated with these areas could eventually grow to unacceptable levels.
Yeah, I hope not, but it's a possibility. And once again, let's see how things play out for Florida and other at-risk states over the coming decades. My best wishes go out to them.
Absolutely. Well, on that happy note, join us next time for an interview with my namesake and one of our best friends, Sachin Shiva, where we will have a conversation on some of his own research surrounding building a more inclusive economy.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Toast and Topics. Before signing off, we wanted to disclose that the views expressed in this podcast are not representative of the organizations that we are associated with. If you learned something in this episode, please share it with a friend or leave us a review. Until next time.